Sometimes the loneliest roads lead us exactly where we need to be. When a man has nothing left but his worn boots and a faithful donkey, $9 can mean everything. Amos McCrae bought an abandoned barn for pocket change in a forgotten town. Most figured he'd finally lost his mind. But when those heavy red doors creaked open, he found something hidden for 40 years, an old mail station filled with letters that never made it home. As Amos delivered those long-lost messages across the dusty plains, healing old wounds and reconnecting broken families, he discovered his own past was buried in those walls. Good $9 and a stubborn heart bring a dying town back to life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust rose in small clouds behind Maud's hooves as they made their way down the center of what used to be Main Street. Amos McCrae sat easy in the saddle, though easy was a relative term for a man whose body had collected nearly 60 years of hard miles. The leather creaked with each step, a comfortable sound that had become the rhythm of his life. Redemption Flats wasn't much to look at these days. The buildings leaned like tired old men against each other, their paint long since surrendered to the sun and wind. Windows stared vacant from storefronts that once sold dry goods, boots, and hope. The railroad had moved its route 15 miles south back in 1890, and the town had been bleeding out slowly ever since. What remained was stubborn rather than thriving. Maybe 24 souls too rooted or too broke to leave. Amos had seen plenty of dying towns in his years of wandering. This one felt different somehow, though he couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light hit the weathered boards, turning them golden instead of grey. Maybe it was the fact that he was tired down to his bones and needed to stop somewhere, anywhere. Maud's ears swiveled forward, tracking a dog that watched them from the shade of the old bank building. The donkey had opinions about most things, and dogs ranked somewhere between suspicious and tolerable. She'd been with Amos for 12 years now, longer than any friendship he'd managed with humans. She was stubborn, occasionally mean-spirited, and absolutely loyal. That counted for something. "Easy, girl," Amos said, though Maud hadn't shown any sign of breaking stride. Talking to her had become habit, a way of keeping the silence from growing too heavy. The general store sat on the corner where Main Street met what optimistic founders had named Commerce Avenue. The sign hanging above the door read Branson's in faded red letters. Amos dismounted, his knees reminding him of a fall from a horse 20 years back, and tied Maud to the hitching post. She immediately set about finding the loosest board to test with her teeth. Inside, the store smelled of old wood, coffee, and the particular mustiness that came from merchandise that turned over slowly, if at all. Shelves held canned goods, basic tools, and sundries that looked like they'd been sitting in the same spots for years. An old man stood behind the counter reading a newspaper that had to be at least a week old. "Help you?" the man asked, looking up over wire-rimmed spectacles. His face was mapped with lines that spoke of hard weather and harder times, but his eyes held a sharpness that age hadn't dulled. "Need some basic supplies," Amos said. "Coffee, beans, flour? Whatever you've got that'll keep." The old man nodded and began gathering items. "Passing through. Might be staying a bit." Amos pulled out his leather wallet, thin enough to see through in the light. "Name's Amos McCrae. Most folks call me Skinny, though I've filled out some since the name stuck. Eli Branson. This is my place, such as it is." He set the supplies on the counter. "Not much call for staying in Redemption Flats these days. Town's pretty well used up. Heard there might be a barn for sale. Out past the old rail depot." Eli's hands stilled on the coffee tin. "The Hutchins barn. Been empty since old Samuel Hutchins passed back in 85. His widow tried to sell it for years. But there's no market for barns in a town with more buildings than people." He studied Amos with renewed interest. "What would you want with that old place?" "Somewhere to get out of the weather. Keep my donkey. Maybe have a roof that doesn't leak for a change." Amos counted out coins for the supplies. "Who would I talk to about buying it?" "Harold Finch handles what passes for land transactions around here." You'll find him at the surveyor's office, 2 buildings down, south side. Eli paused, then added, "Don't expect much. That barn's been sitting empty 40 years. Could be full of nothing but rats and rot by now. I've slept in worse." Amos gathered his supplies. Much obliged for the information. As he turned to leave, Eli called after him. "McCrae, that's not a name I've heard around here in a long time." Amos stopped, but didn't turn around. "It's common enough." "Maybe so." Eli's voice carried a note of something, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. "Just struck me as interesting is all." Outside, Maud had given up on the hitching post and was eyeing a barrel of what looked like dried corn. Amos loaded the supplies into his saddlebags and untied her before she could cause trouble. The surveyor's office was exactly where Eli had said, a narrow building squeezed between what used to be a barber shop and a boarded-up saloon. Harold Finch turned out to be a thin man in his 70s with hands that tremored slightly when he reached for the property records. The office was cramped, filled with dusty ledgers and rolled maps that might not have been unrolled in a decade. "The Hutchins barn," Harold repeated, running his finger down a column of entries. "Yes, here it is. 40 acres, more or less, with the barn structure and an old well. Been in probate for years, but the widow's daughter just wants it gone. She moved to Denver 30 years ago, got no use for property out here. What's she asking?" Harold squinted at the notes. "She said she'd take whatever someone would offer, long as the paperwork's proper. Place has been assessed at $20, but between you and me, I'd say she'd part with it for less." Amos thought about the money he had left. Not much, never was. He'd worked ranches, driven cattle, done odd jobs from Montana to New Mexico. Saved what he could, but a man traveling alone didn't accumulate much except experience and scars. "What about $9? Harold looked up, surprised. Then something like sympathy crossed his face. "You that short on funds, friend?" "I'm that short on funds." The old surveyor sat back in his chair, which creaked under even his minimal weight. "I'll wire the daughter, see what she says. But I'll be honest with you. That barn's been neglected a long time. Roof might be gone, walls could be unsafe. You could be buying $9 worth of trouble. Wouldn't be the first time." Amos pulled out his wallet and counted out the bills and coins, setting them on the desk. "I'll take my chances." 3 days later, Amos found himself standing in front of Harold Finch's desk again, this time with Maud tied outside and the morning sun slanting through the dirty window. The surveyor held up a piece of paper, looking both amused and slightly baffled. "She took it," Harold said. $9 for 40 acres and the barn. Said, and I quote, "If someone wants that godforsaken place enough to offer actual money, take it." He pushed the deed across the desk. "Sign here, Mr. McCrae. You're about to be a landowner." The pen felt strange in Amos's hand. He'd signed military papers, work contracts, and the occasional letter, but this was different. This was permanent in a way that went against every instinct he'd developed over 4 decades of drifting. He wrote his name carefully, Amos Benjamin McCrae, and dated it October 12, 1925. "Congratulations," Harold said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure congratulations were appropriate. "The deed's recorded. Property's yours free and clear, no taxes owed." He handed Amos a large iron key. "This was with the paperwork. Might be for the barn, might not. Place has been locked up since Samuel Hutchins died." Amos closed his fingers around the key. It was heavy, solid, real. "He die in the barn?" "No, died in his sleep in town. Natural causes, far as anyone knows. But he was the last person to go in that barn. Kept it locked up tight those last few years he was alive. Wouldn't let anyone near it." Harold leaned back. "There's stories, of course. Town like this, there's always stories. Some say old Samuel went peculiar toward the end, talking about things that needed protecting. But he was 93, so peculiar comes with the territory." "What kind of things?" Harold shrugged. No one knew. He'd just mutter about keeping watch, making sure nothing got disturbed. Most figured he'd stored some personal items he didn't want picked over. After he died, the family respected his wishes and kept it locked. Eventually, they just forgot about it. Amos pocketed the key along with the deed. For $9, he now owned more than he'd possessed in his entire life. The thought sat heavy and strange. like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. "One more thing," Harold said as Amos turned to leave. "If you find anything valuable in there, anything worth selling, you let me know. Could be old Samuel stashed something away. The family wouldn't mind a share if it turns out there's more to that place than dust and memories." Outside, Amos found Maud contentedly working on someone's flower box. He retrieved her and swung into the saddle, his knee only complaining a little this time. Martha Hayes was sweeping the steps of her cafe across the street, and she paused to watch him pass. She was maybe 50, with grey threading through, dark hair and a face that suggested she'd weathered her share of disappointments without letting them break her. "Heard you bought the Hutchins." "Place," she called out. News travelled fast in small towns. Amos touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Dutch Keller's been asking about you." She leaned on her broom. "Owns the big ranch north of town. He's not usually interested in newcomers unless he thinks they might cause him trouble. I'm not looking for trouble. That's what most folks say." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "But trouble has a way of finding people anyway. You'd need a decent meal before you head out to that barn you come by. I'll feed you for a fair price." "I appreciate that." He guided Maud south, following the rough track that led past where the rail depot used to stand. The land here rolled in gentle swells, covered in prairie grass gone brown with autumn. A few cottonwoods marked an old creek bed, their leaves already fallen. In the distance, he could make out the barn, standing alone against the horizon, like a ship run aground. Amos had learned early not to let himself want things too much. Wanting led to disappointment, and disappointment could wear a man down faster than hard work or bad weather. But as he rode toward that barn, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of it. He'd spent the last 40 years moving, staying ahead of whatever was behind him. The military had taught him to be still and patient when necessary, but civilian life had him running from one job to the next, one town to another. He'd told himself he preferred it that way, that roots were for trees and settlers, not for men like him. The truth was, he was tired. Tired of sleeping in different places every few weeks, tired of not knowing anyone's name, tired of waking up and having to remember where he was. Maud wasn't getting any younger either, and she deserved better than constant travel. Maybe this barn, worthless as it probably was, could be the place where they both finally stopped. The afternoon sun caught the weathered wood as he approached, turning the red paint, what little remained, into the color of old blood. The structure was bigger than he'd expected, 2 stories with a hayloft and what looked like smaller rooms or stalls on either end. The roof sagged in the middle, but appeared mostly intact. Heavy doors, painted red years ago, were secured with a rusty chain and an ancient padlock. Amos dismounted and stood for a moment, just looking. 40 years of wind and weather had scoured the place clean of pretense. It was what it was, a barn that had outlasted its purpose, waiting to see if it had any use left in it. He pulled the iron key from his pocket. It was old-fashioned, the kind that required heft and deliberate turning. As he approached the doors, Maud snorted behind him, her way of offering commentary on the situation. "I know," Amos said quietly, "but it's ours now." The key slid into the padlock with surprising ease, as if Samuel Hutchins had kept it oiled even in his final years. The lock released with a solid click. Amos unwound the chain, noting how its weight had worn grooves in the old wood. Whatever was inside, Samuel had wanted it secured. The doors resisted at first, then gave with a groan that seemed to come from deep in the earth itself. Darkness yawned beyond, thick and undisturbed. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of afternoon light that cut through the opening. Amos stood at the threshold, one hand still on the door, and realized his heart was beating faster than it had in years. Whatever lay beyond those doors had been sealed away since before he was born. Waiting in the dark, like a held breath, he pulled the right door wide, then the left, letting the light flood in. For a long moment, Amos could only stand and stare. The barn wasn't empty. It wasn't full of rats and rot like Eli Branson had suggested. It wasn't the hollow shell of a forgotten building. Instead, frozen in the dim light like a photograph from another era, was a complete and intact mail station from a time when Redemption Flats had been more than a name on old maps. The sorting bins stood against the far wall, their wooden slots still labeled with destinations that might not exist anymore, places like Silver Creek, Granger's Mill, and Fort Harrison. Canvas mail sacks hung from iron hooks, their fabric stiff with age, but surprisingly whole. A clerk's desk sat in the corner, its surface clean except for a thick layer of undisturbed dust that looked like grey snow. Amos stepped inside slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air smelled of old paper, dried leather, and time itself, not unpleasant, just ancient. Sunlight slanted through gaps in the walls, creating bars of gold in the dusty air. It felt like stepping into a tomb. Except this was a tomb for words, for connections, for all the things people had tried to send to each other and never could. Wooden crates were stacked along the right side of the barn, each one marked with dates. 1883, 1884, 1885. The last crate bore the date March 1885, and above it someone had written in faded letters, "Awaiting delivery. 40 years." These letters and packages had been waiting 40 years. Amos moved to the nearest crate and pried open the lid. Inside, bundled in neat stacks and separated by twine, were letters. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The paper had yellowed, but remained intact in the dry darkness. He lifted one bundle carefully, the twine crumbling slightly at his touch, and saw names written in careful script. The Thornton family, CEO General Delivery, Redemption Flats. Maud appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. She brayed once, as if asking what was taking so long, then settled herself to wait. Animals had a way of being patient with human foolishness. On the clerk's desk, Amos found what he was looking for. A large, leather-bound ledger with Station Master embossed in gold on the cover. He opened it carefully, half expecting the pages to crumble, but the leather had preserved them well. The handwriting inside was meticulous, each entry recorded with the precision of someone who took their work seriously. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1883. Silas McCrae, Station Master, Redemption Flats Mail Station. By appointment of the Territorial Postal Service. May my watch be faithful and my service true, McCrae. Amos felt something tighten in his chest. It was a common enough name, but not so common that he could ignore it. His own family name, written in this ledger over 40 years ago by a man who'd stood in this very building. He flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. Each one recorded incoming and outgoing mail, packages, telegrams. The penmanship was beautiful, almost artistic, the kind of careful work that came from taking pride in details. Notes filled the margins, observations about weather, town events, personal reminders. February 14th, 1883. Heavy snow. Delayed delivery to Fort Harrison by 3 days. Mrs. Patterson's valentine to her husband will arrive late. She took the news hard. May 2nd, 1883, baby born to the Henshaw family. 3 packages arrived for the child, blankets and clothes from relatives back east, delivered same day. The joy on their faces makes this work worthwhile. September 7th, 1883, fire at the Johnson Ranch. Lost everything. Letters of condolence arriving daily, also 2 bank drafts to help them rebuild. This is what mail service truly means. Connection when it matters most. Amos found himself drawn into the ledger, reading entry after entry. Silas McCrae had been more than a clerk sorting letters. He'd been a guardian of connections, someone who understood that each envelope carried more than paper. It carried hope, love, grief, news that could change lives. The last entry stopped him cold. March 15th, 1885. The land deed arrives today for my son. This will change everything for our family. Finally, we'll have security, a future. But I fear I've made enemies with my honesty. Sam Keller came by again, making offers, making threats when I refused. I must protect this delivery. I must protect my family. Whatever comes, this station will... The entry ended mid-sentence. No period, no conclusion. Just an abrupt stop, as if Silas McCrae had been interrupted and never came back. Amos closed the ledger slowly and looked around the barn with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned mail station. This was a mystery frozen in time. Something had happened here in March of 1885. Something that had stopped Silas McCrae from finishing his work, from delivering all this mail, from completing that final thought in his ledger. He moved back to the crates and began examining their contents more carefully. Letters mostly addressed to families throughout the territory, but also packages, some small enough to fit in a pocket, others substantial enough to require both hands. Each one labeled, dated, organized with the same careful attention that filled the ledger. One letter near the top of the first crate caught his eye. It was addressed in a young person's hand, the letters formed with more care than skill. The return address read, Private James Whitmore, 7th Cavalry, Fort Crittenden. The addressee was Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, Redemption Flats. Amos held the letter for a long moment, feeling its weight. A soldier writing to his mother. How many letters just like this had he seen in his own time in the military? How many had he written himself, hoping they'd reach someone who cared, whether he lived or died? The flap wasn't sealed, just tucked. Time and dryness had loosened the glue. Against his better judgment, but unable to resist, Amos carefully opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Dear Mama, it began. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that we're moving out on patrol tomorrow, heading north toward hostile territory. The captain says it'll be routine, but we all know better. I wanted to write in case something happens, to tell you that I love you and that every good thing I ever learned came from you. Remember when I was small and afraid of the dark? You told me that darkness was just light waiting to happen. I've thought about that a lot out here. If this is my darkness, then I'm waiting for the light. Take care of yourself, Mama. I'll write again when I can. Your loving son, James. Amos refolded the letter with hands that had steadied themselves through combat and crisis, but trembled now. Private James Whitmore had written to his mother in what might have been his final hours. He'd entrusted his words to the mail service, believing they'd reach her. And instead, they'd sat in a crate in a locked barn for 40 years. Had Eleanor Whitmore spent those years wondering why her son never wrote? Had she died, not knowing he'd thought of her, loved her, carried her lessons into his final days? The weight of it settled on Amos like a physical thing. This wasn't just one letter. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of these moments preserved in the darkness. Birthdays missed, marriages announced, deaths reported, love confessed, all of it trapped here, undelivered, unknown. He thought of his own father, dead now for 30 years. They'd never been close. The old man had been hard and distant, speaking more with his fists than his words. When Amos had left home at 17 to join the cavalry, neither of them had said goodbye. Years later, after he'd made something of himself in the military, Amos had written a letter. Not an apology exactly, but an explanation, maybe a bridge. He'd never heard back. Eventually, he'd convinced himself the old man had thrown it away unread, or that they'd moved and the letter had been lost, or that some wounds were too deep for paper to heal. But what if it had been like this? What if his letter had arrived and somehow never been delivered? What if his father had died not knowing his son had tried to reach out? The parallel was too close, too painful. Amos set the soldier's letter back in its bundle and closed the crate. But closing the crate didn't close the question now burning in his mind. These letters deserved to be delivered. 40 years late, yes. Maybe too late to matter to most of the people who'd sent them or were meant to receive them. But someone needed to know. Daughters needed to know their fathers had thought of them. Wives needed to know their husbands had loved them. Mothers needed to know their sons had remembered them in the end. He couldn't bring back the lost decades, couldn't undo whatever had happened to Silas McCrae in 1885, but he could finish the work. He could take these letters and packages out of the darkness and into the light, however late that light might be. Maud brayed again, more insistently this time. Amos walked to the door and stood beside her, looking out at the rolling prairie. The sun was lower now, painting the grass gold and amber. In the distance, he could just make out the buildings of Redemption Flats, such as they were. "We've got work to do, girl," he said quietly. "Might take some time. Might be foolish, but someone's got to do it. The donkey turned her head to look at him with one dark eye, then went back to watching the horizon. If she had an opinion on the matter, she kept it to herself. Amos pulled the barn doors closed again, but didn't lock them. He'd be back at first light to begin the real work, cataloguing everything, finding out which families still existed, planning routes for delivery. It would take weeks, maybe months. He'd need help understanding the history, tracking down descendants, figuring out what had happened here. But for tonight, he had a place to sleep that was his own. He had work that mattered. And he had, for the first time in longer than he could remember, a purpose beyond just surviving another day. As he rode Maud back toward town, the iron key heavy in his pocket, Amos McCrae allowed himself something he'd denied for most of his life. He allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found the reason he'd wandered all these years. Not to escape something, but to arrive at this place, at this moment, to finish what someone else had started so long ago. The dying light caught Maud's ears as they swiveled forward, tracking sounds Amos couldn't hear yet. She'd heard something in the silence that always seemed to surround this country, something that promised change was coming, whether the world was ready for it or not. Behind them, the barn stood against the darkening sky, no longer just a forgotten structure, but a repository of stories waiting to be told. And Amos, despite everything he'd learned about disappointment and loss, felt the dangerous stirring of hope take root and grow. The work took over Amos's life in a way nothing had since his military days. He moved into the barn, making a simple camp in the corner with his bedroll and gear. Maud occupied what had once been a tack room, seemingly content with the arrangement. Each morning before dawn, he'd wake to the sound of her shifting in the straw, and he'd begin the day's work by lamplight. The ledger became his Bible and his map. Silas McCrae had been nothing if not thorough. Every piece of mail was recorded. Sender, recipient, date received, intended delivery date. Some entries included notes, Mrs. Henderson expecting news of daughter's baby, or Thornton land deed, important, deliver by hand. The man had cared about his work in a way that Amos recognized and respected. He created his own system, organizing the letters and packages by family name first, then by date. He made lists of all the names, checking them against what he could remember from his brief time in town. Some names he recognized from storefronts or from conversations with Eli. Others were complete mysteries. Families that might have moved on or died out decades ago. On the third day, Martha Hayes appeared at the barn door with a basket and a curious expression. She stood for a moment, taking in the organized chaos of letters spread across makeshift tables. The crates opened and inventoried. Amos bent over the ledger, making notes. "Heard you've been sleeping out here," she said. "Figured you could use some real food." Amos straightened, his back protesting. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Hayes." "Martha's fine." She stepped inside, setting the basket on the corner of his work table. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here?" He gestured at the letters. "Found a mail station. Been closed up since 1885. All this mail was never delivered." Martha moved closer, her eyes widening as she took in the sheer volume of correspondence. "My lord, 40 years of letters? Not quite 40 years' worth. Looks like the station operated for maybe 2-3 years before it shut down. But everything from those last few months just got left here." Amos pulled out the ledger. "The station master's name was Silas McCrae. Same as mine. That's partly why I feel responsible, I suppose. You're going to deliver them." The question held both skepticism and something that might have been hope. Going to try. Don't know how many of these people are still alive, still around. But someone ought to know these letters existed, that people tried to reach them. Martha was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's either the kindest thing I've heard in years or the most foolish. Maybe both. Won't be the first time someone's accused me of foolishness." She smiled at that. "I brought coffee too. Fresh this morning." She unpacked the basket, sandwiches, coffee in a jar still warm, and 2 thick slices of apple pie. "I'd like to help if you'll let me. I've lived here my whole life. I might know some of these families, or at least know what happened to them." Amos nodded slowly. Company wasn't something he was used to, but the work was bigger than his solitude. I'd appreciate that. They sat on crates and ate, while Martha looked through the lists he'd made. She recognized many of the names, providing context that the ledger couldn't. The Thorntons had moved to Montana in the 1890s, but their daughter Sarah had married and stayed local. The Hendersons were all gone, died out, or moved away. The Blackwell family still had a ranch 20 miles north. "This is remarkable," Martha said, running her finger down the list. "It's like a snapshot of the town when it was alive. My parents are probably in here somewhere." She paused. "Hayes. Did you find any letters for Hayes?" Amos checked his notes. 3 letters and a package. All addressed to Thomas and Elizabeth Hayes. "My parents." Her voice softened. "Both dead now. Been gone for years." She looked at him. "Can I see them?" He found the bundle and handed it over. Martha held the letters carefully, her eyes filling with tears she didn't try to hide. "The handwriting on this one. That's my grandmother's. I'd recognize it anywhere. She died when I was 7. I barely remember her, but I remember her handwriting from the Christmas cards she'd send. You should read them," Amos said. "They're yours now, in a way." "Later," she said, tucking them into her apron pocket. "When I can sit with them properly." She wiped her eyes and looked at him. "You're giving people pieces of their history back." "That's no small thing, Amos McCrae." Over the next week, with Martha's help, Amos created a delivery map. They used the old ledger's dates to prioritize. The oldest letters first, especially those marked as important or time-sensitive. Even 40 years late, there was something right about honoring the original station master's intent. The first package they fully examined was small, wrapped in brown paper that had yellowed but held together. The address read, "Miss Sarah Hutchins, Redemption Flats, for her 8th birthday." The sender was listed as Captain John Hutchins, Fort Crittenden. Martha's breath caught. Sarah Thornton, as she is now. "She's still alive, lives just outside town." That must be from her father. He was cavalry, died in service when she was young. Amos carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small wooden box, and inside that, nested in faded tissue paper, was a hand-carved horse. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every detail of the mane, the arch of the neck, the powerful legs captured in miniature. Someone had spent hours carving this with love and skill. Her father made that, Martha whispered. He was known for woodworking. Sarah talks about him sometimes, says she barely remembers him, but wishes she'd known him better. Amos turned the horse over in his hands. It was small enough to fit in his palm, but felt immensely heavy with meaning. She never got this. Never knew he sent it. She thought he'd forgotten her birthday. I remember her saying that once, years ago. Said it was one of her few clear memories, that her 8th birthday came and went with no word from him. And he died 3 months later. Martha looked at Amos. She spent 63 years thinking her father forgot her. The weight of that settled between them. One small horse carved with love, trapped in darkness for decades, while a daughter grew up believing she'd been forgotten. "This has to be the first delivery," Amos said. "Tomorrow morning." That evening, Amos cleaned the carved horse carefully, using a soft cloth to remove the dust of 40 years. The wood gleamed under the lamplight, golden and warm. The level of detail amazed him. You could see individual strands in the mane, the flare of the nostrils, even tiny lines suggesting the horse's coat. This was a father's love made tangible, a gift meant to bridge the distance between a soldier and his daughter. He thought of his own father, a man who'd never carved anything except wounds into his son's memory. They'd shared a name and blood, but little else. When Amos had left home, he'd promised himself he'd be different if he ever had children of his own. But he'd never stayed anywhere long enough for that, never let anyone close enough for that kind of future. Maybe that was why these letters mattered so much. They represented all the things he'd never had and never been. Connection, family, the kind of love that persisted across distance and time. Delivering them couldn't give him those things, but maybe it could give them back to others. Martha had drawn him a map to Sarah Thornton's house and provided background. Sarah was 71 now, a widow with children and grandchildren. She'd stayed in Redemption Flats out of stubbornness more than prosperity, keeping a small ranch going through sheer will. She was sharp-minded and sharp-tongued, not one for sentiment, but underneath it all, She carried the weight of a father she'd barely known, as Amos packed the horse carefully into his saddlebag. Wrapped in clean cloth, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before important missions. This was different from military operations, but the stakes felt just as high. He was carrying more than a carved wooden horse. He was carrying a father's love across 40 years of darkness into what he hoped would be light. Maud seemed to sense the importance of the next day. She was quieter than usual, standing still while Amos checked her hooves and brushed her coat. He'd learned to read her moods over the years, and tonight she was serious, almost solemn. "First one tomorrow, girl," he said quietly. "After that there'll be hundreds more. We've got a long road ahead." The donkey huffed once and returned to her hay, and Amos took that as agreement, or at least not disagreement, which from Maud was close enough. He spent the last hours before sleep reviewing Silas McCrae's ledger notes about the birthday package. The entry was brief, but touched with emotion. "Captain Hutchins's birthday gift for his daughter. He asked me to ensure it reached her on March 20th no matter what. The devotion of a father for his child, even across the distance of duty. I will see it done." But Silas hadn't seen it done. Something had stopped him, something that had closed this station and sealed these letters away from the world. Amos didn't know what yet, but he felt certain he'd find out. The ledger held secrets, and the barn itself might hold more. For now, though, he had a simpler mission. Return a father's love to a daughter who'd waited her whole life without knowing she was waiting at all. As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Amos led Maud out of the barn. The carved horse rested in his saddlebag, wrapped and protected. Martha had said Sarah Thornton usually took her morning coffee on the porch. So early was the best time to find her at home. The ride would take an hour, maybe less. Amos set an easy pace, letting Maud choose her footing on the rough trail. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distance. Behind them, the barn grew smaller against the horizon, but felt more present than ever. A promise he'd made to a man named Silas McCrae, and to hundreds of voices waiting in the dark. Whatever came next, whatever Sarah Thornton's reaction might be, this was the beginning. The first letter delivered, the first connection restored, the first step toward finishing work that should have been done 40 years ago. And Amos McCrae, who'd spent most of his life running from roots and connection, was finally standing still long enough to give them back to others. Sarah Thornton's ranch sat on a piece of land that had clearly seen better days. The house was solid enough, but the barn needed paint and the fences needed mending. A few cattle grazed in the near pasture, and chickens scattered as Amos and Maud approached. Just as Martha had predicted, Sarah sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning unfold. She was a small woman, made smaller by age, but there was nothing diminished about the way she held herself. Her eyes tracked Amos's approach with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust strangers bearing news. "Mrs. Thornton?" Amos dismounted, leaving Maud tied to the porch rail. "That depends on what you're selling." Her voice was firm, matter-of-fact. "I'm not selling anything. My name's Amos McCrae. I bought the old Hutchins barn outside town. Own something inside that belongs to you." Her expression shifted slightly. "The Hutchins place? That old barn's been locked up since I was a girl." "Yes, ma'am. That's part of why I'm here." Amos pulled the wrapped package from his saddlebag and climbed the porch steps. Inside was a mail station from the 1880s, lots of letters and packages that never got delivered. "This one was for you." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the package. She read the faded address, and something in her face crumbled. "My father sent this? According to the ledger, it was meant for your 8th birthday. March 20th, 1863. I never got it." She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears. "I thought he'd forgotten. My whole life I thought he'd forgotten." "He didn't forget, ma'am. It just never made it to you." Sarah unwrapped the package with careful hands, and when she saw the carved horse, a sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob. She held it up to the morning light, turning it slowly. "He made this. He made things with his hands, beautiful things. I barely remember him, but I remember that. He loved you very much." The station master wrote that in his ledger, Silas McCrae. Sarah's voice was distant now, lost in memory. I remember him too. Kind man, took his work seriously. He disappeared right around the time this would have been sent. There was talk he'd run off with money, but my mother never believed it. Amos filed that information away. Do you remember anything else about what happened? I was 8 years old. Mostly I remember being sad about my birthday, and then a few weeks later the mail station was closed and Silas was gone. My father died that summer. She held the horse close to her chest. All these years I could have had this. Could have known he remembered. There was nothing Amos could say that would give back those years. Instead, he just stood quietly while she cried, holding 63 years of grief in her hands. Finally, Sarah looked up at him. You're doing a good thing, Mr. McCrae, finishing what Silas started. That's the name you said, McCrae? Yes, ma'am. Any relation? I don't know, maybe. Amos shifted his weight. I plan to deliver all the mail I found. There's a lot of it. You do that, Sarah said firmly. Every piece. People deserve to know they weren't forgotten. By noon, word had spread through Redemption Flats like wildfire. The man who'd bought the barn for $9 had found 40 years of lost mail and was delivering it. Martha had customers at the cafe asking questions, and Eli Branson reported people stopping by the store just to hear the story. Amos's second delivery took him north to the Blackwell Ranch, a substantial operation that sprawled across several thousand acres. The current owner, Thomas Blackwell, was in his 40s, prosperous and suspicious when Amos explained his purpose. My grandfather might have gotten mail back then, Thomas said, not inviting Amos inside. But he's dead 30 years now. I have a letter here marked urgent. From a private Daniel Blackwell. Amos held out the blood-stained envelope. The station master noted it was a soldier's farewell. Thomas's expression changed. He took the envelope carefully. Daniel was my grandfather's younger brother. Died in the Indian Wars, never married, no children. The family always wondered what happened to him. The letter might tell you. Thomas opened it right there on the porch, reading in silence. When he finished, his eyes were wet. He wrote this the night before the battle where he died. Says he loved his brother, loved his family, was proud to serve. Says if anything happened to him, he hoped they'd remember him as someone who tried to do right. He folded the letter carefully. My grandfather talked about Daniel sometimes. Always wondered if his brother had thought of him at the end. Now I know he did. Not every delivery went as smoothly. Dutch Keller found Amos on the trail back to town, riding a horse too fine for rough country and wearing an expression that suggested he was used to getting his way. McCrae, Keller said, not bothering with pleasantries. Heard you're stirring up the past. Just delivering mail, 40-year-old mail, to people who've moved on. You think that's wise? Amos met his gaze steadily. I think it's necessary. Some things are better left buried. Keller's horse shifted, and he controlled it with practiced ease. I own most of the land around here. The Keller family built this area up when it was nothing but dust and dreams. We don't need someone digging up old history that might cause trouble. These are letters. Mr. Keller, not accusations. Letters can be accusations, depending on what's in them. Keller leaned forward in his saddle. I'm telling you friendly-like, leave the past alone. Deliver what you want, but don't go looking for trouble that doesn't concern you. Seems to me you're the one concerned about it. Keller's jaw tightened. You've been warned. He wheeled his horse and rode off, leaving Amos with the distinct impression he'd just made an enemy. The third delivery brought laughter instead of tears. Albert and Rose Cooper, married 52 years, received letters they'd sent each other during their courtship. Rose's letter to Albert was a passionate declaration of love, written when she was 19 and bold. Albert's response was poetry of questionable quality but undeniable sincerity. I wrote that. Albert squinted at his own handwriting. Lord, I was a fool I married, Rose said, swatting his arm. Read the part about my eyes being like stars. I made you write that 3 times before you got it right. They invited Amos in for coffee and spent an hour reading the letters aloud to each other, laughing at their younger selves. It was the kind of joy that came from seeing who you'd been and knowing you'd chosen right despite everything. As Amos left their small house, Rose caught his arm. "Thank you for this. We've had a good life, but knowing these letters existed, that we tried so hard to reach each other even back then, it means something. You're giving people their stories back, but not everyone felt that way." Over the next few days, as Amos continued deliveries, he noticed the town dividing. Some people, like Martha and Eli, supported what he was doing. Others, particularly those in Dutch Keller's sphere of influence, thought he should let sleeping dogs lie. There were whispers about disturbing the dead, about causing unnecessary pain, about strangers who didn't understand how things worked around here. Amos ignored most of it. He had work to do, and the opinions of others had never stopped him before. But the resistance made him cautious. There was something in Keller's reaction that felt like fear, and fearful men were dangerous. Eli Branson stopped by the barn one evening, bringing supplies and curiosity. "Martha tells me you found Hayes' family letters. Got me wondering if there might be something for my family too." Amos checked his lists. 3 letters for Branson. 2 for your father, Jeremiah, and 1 for your mother, Ruth. They're both gone now. Dad died in 1910. Mom followed in 1915. Eli accepted the letters. "Mind if I read them here?" "It's your barn as much as mine," Eli read in the lamplight, while Amos continued his cataloguing. After a while, the old shopkeeper spoke. "This one's from my brother, Samuel. He left home in 1884, heading west to find gold. We never heard from him again. Figured he died somewhere on the trail or in the mines. What does he say? That he made it to California. That he found work, not gold, but honest work that kept him fed. That he was sorry he left the way he did." Eli's voice was rough. "He says he was planning to come home, just needed to save enough money first. The letters dated February 1885. He never made it back. No, but now I know he tried. No, he didn't just forget about us." Eli folded the letter carefully. "That's something. After 40 years of wondering, that's something." As Eli was leaving, he paused at the door. "Amos, be careful with Keller. His family's got deep roots here, and not all of them clean. If you find something in those letters that threatens his position, he won't let it go quietly. I'm just delivering mail. You're delivering history. Sometimes that's more dangerous." That night, alone in the barn with only Maud for company, Amos finally allowed himself to examine the bundle of McCrae letters he'd been avoiding. There were 5 in total, all addressed to someone named William McCrae at an address in Redemption Flats. The first letter was from Silas McCrae to his son. "The deed comes tomorrow. After all these years of scraping by, we'll finally have security. The land is good, and with proper title we can build something lasting. This is for you and your children, William. This is our future." The second letter was from a territorial official, formal and brief. "Land grant approved. Deed forthcoming to William McCrae for 800 acres, Section 12, Township 4. Amos's hands shook as he read the third letter. It was a legal document, the actual deed, granting ownership of substantial acreage to William McCrae. The date was March 14th, 1885, one day before Silas McCrae's last ledger entry. Without that deed, delivered to his son, Silas McCrae's family would have had no legal claim to the land. With it, they would have been wealthy, secure, established. Amos traced the address on the envelope with one finger. His grandfather, if Silas was indeed his grandfather, had died trying to deliver this deed, and someone, somewhere, had made sure it never arrived. Amos sat with the deed in his hands for a long time, watching the lamplight flicker across the yellowed paper. 800 acres. Section 12, Township 4. He didn't need a map to know where that land was. Everyone in Redemption Flats knew. It was the heart of Dutch Keller's ranch, the most prosperous spread in the territory, the foundation of the Keller family fortune. Except it shouldn't have been the Keller land at all. It should have been McCrae land. The memories came flooding back, uninvited but undeniable. Amos had been raised by his uncle after his parents died. His father from drink and despair when Amos was 12, his mother from grief 2 years later. His uncle had been a hard man, made harder by poverty, and he'd never hidden his bitterness about the McCrae family's fate. "We should have had land," his uncle would say, usually when he'd been drinking. "Your grandfather had a claim, a proper legal claim, but it disappeared. The Kellers took it all, said they had rightful ownership when old Silas ran off. But Silas didn't run off. Something happened to him, and the Kellers knew what. Amos had dismissed it as the ramblings of a bitter drunk. Every poor family had stories about how they should have been rich, how someone had cheated them, how the world was unfair. He'd stopped listening after a while, focused on getting out, on making his own way where family history couldn't drag him down. But now, holding the deed that proved every word his uncle had said, Amos felt the weight of 3 generations of poverty and loss. His grandfather Silas had been murdered or driven off to prevent this deed from reaching its intended recipient. His father William had grown up dispossessed, bitter, angry, that anger passed down like the family name. And Amos himself had spent his entire life wandering because he'd had no place to call home, no roots to anchor him. All because someone had wanted this land badly enough to destroy the McCrae family to get it. The 4th letter confirmed his suspicions. It was from Samuel Keller to Silas McCrae, dated March 10, 1885. "Silas, I'm prepared to make a final offer for your son's land claim, $500 cash money. I know the deed hasn't arrived yet, but when it does, convince William to sell. This is generous, considering the land's current state. After this, my offer expires, $500, for land that would be worth tens of thousands now." And when Silas refused, when he chose to give his son a future instead of selling it for pennies, Samuel Keller had taken more permanent measures. The 5th letter was in a different hand. Shaky but determined. "William McCrae, your father is missing. The marshal says he likely ran off with postal funds, but I don't believe it." Silas was honest to his bones. "Something happened to him, and I fear Samuel Keller knows what. But I'm just an old woman, and the Kellers have power. Watch yourself, boy. Watch your back." "Mrs. Henderson," Amos set the letters down carefully, his hands trembling with something between rage and grief. The picture was clear now. Samuel Keller had wanted the land. Silas McCrae had refused to sell. When the deed arrived, Silas was eliminated, the mail station was closed, and the deed disappeared. Without proof of ownership, William McCrae couldn't claim the land. Samuel Keller stepped in, likely producing some fraudulent documents, and claimed it for himself. The McCrae family had been destroyed methodically, carefully, legally, and Dutch Keller, sitting up in his fine ranch house on stolen land. He knew exactly what his grandfather had done. Martha found him the next morning, still sitting with the letters, his eyes red from lack of sleep and something deeper. "Amos." She set down the coffee she'd brought. "What's wrong?" He handed her the letters without speaking. She read them slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to horror to anger. "Oh, Amos, this is your family. My grandfather was the station master. My father was supposed to get this land. My entire life," he stopped, unable to finish the thought. His entire life had been shaped by a crime committed before he was born. Every hard year, every disappointment, every moment of wandering and loneliness traced back to this barn, these letters, this stolen deed. Martha sat beside him on the crate. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." The words felt inadequate. "Part of me wants to march up to Keller's ranch and put these letters in his face, wants to see him admit what his family did. And the other part? The other part knows it won't change anything. My grandfather's dead. My father's dead. 3 generations of McCraes lived and died poor because of this, and no confession from Dutch Keller will bring them back or give us those years. The deed's still legal," Martha said quietly. "You could claim the land, you're Silas McCrae's heir, and tear apart this town in the process? Set myself against the most powerful family in the county?" Amos shook his head. "I didn't come here looking for revenge or restitution. I came here looking for a place to rest, but this is your place. It was always meant to be yours." The truth of that sat heavy between them. This wasn't just about one old barn bought for $9. This was about justice denied, about crimes buried under decades of dust, about a family destroyed and a family built on that destruction. "I need to think," Amos said finally. "Need to figure out what's right, not just what's fair." Martha squeezed his shoulder and left him alone with his thoughts and his family's ghost. The deliveries continued. Amos forced himself back into the work, using it to quiet the rage that threatened to consume his better judgment. Each letter he delivered was a reminder that connection mattered, that reaching across time and distance could heal old wounds. But his own wound felt too deep for simple healing. A widow in her 80s received a love letter from her husband, dead 40 years, and wept with joy at hearing his voice again through the faded ink. A middle-aged man learned his father had tried to send money to help the family through hard times, money that never arrived, but proved the man had cared, even when distance made him seem indifferent. A grandmother discovered her mother had sent recipes and family stories meant to pass down traditions that had been lost. The town itself began to change in subtle ways. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves talking again, united by shared history. The cafe saw more business as folks gathered to share their stories about the letters. Eli's store became a meeting place where people compared notes and reconnected with their pasts. Even those who'd been skeptical started to come around. The letters weren't causing pain, they were healing it. Every delivery proved that being remembered mattered, that the things we send out into the world carry weight even when they don't reach their destination right away. But underneath the transformation, tension simmered. Dutch Keller made his disapproval known through pointed comments and subtle pressure. People who worked for him or depended on him economically found themselves caught between supporting Amos's work and maintaining their livelihoods. One evening, as Amos worked in the barn, organizing the next week's deliveries, a young man appeared in the doorway. He was in his early 20s, well-dressed, with Keller features but a gentler expression. "Mr. McCrae." "I'm James Keller, Dutch's grandson." Amos straightened, instantly wary. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to see the letters for myself. Everyone's talking about them, and my grandfather refuses to discuss it." James stepped inside tentatively. "I've heard he's been threatening you." "I wanted to apologize for that, and to say not all Kellers agree with his approach. That's decent of you. I've also heard you found letters with the McCrae name." "Letters that might involve my family?" James met his eyes directly. "I'm a law student at the university. If there's something in those letters that suggests wrongdoing, I think it should come to light, even if it implicates my own family." Amos studied the young man. He saw none of Dutch's hardness, none of the entitlement that came from growing up with wealth and power. Instead, he saw something that looked like genuine integrity. "Your great-grandfather Samuel may have done things that your family benefited from," Amos said carefully. "Things that hurt mine. Then I want to know about it. I don't want to build my life on foundations that aren't clean." James paused. "Whatever you find, Mr. McCrae, I'll support the truth coming out." "That's a promise." After James left, Amos sat with the McCrae letters again. He'd been avoiding the decision, but it was time to face it. These letters needed to be delivered just like all the others. The fact that he was both the deliverer and the recipient didn't change that. The fact that they revealed crimes and injustice didn't change that. The truth deserved light. Regardless of how much darkness it exposed, he made his decision that night. Sitting in the barn while Maud dozed in her stall, he would deliver the McCrae letters publicly, at a town meeting, with everyone present to hear what had happened 40 years ago. Not for revenge. Revenge wouldn't rebuild his family or restore those lost years. But for honesty. For his grandfather Silas, who'd tried to do right and paid with his life. For his father William, who died never knowing the truth. For himself, who'd spent his whole life wandering without understanding why he had no home to return to. The next morning, he rode into town and posted a notice on the board outside Eli's store. "Town meeting, October 25th, 7 p.m. at the church. Important historical discovery." Or welcome. Word spread quickly. Some people were excited, sensing drama. Others were nervous, particularly those connected to the Keller family. Dutch himself rode into town that afternoon, read the notice and tore it down. Amos simply posted another one. Martha found him in the barn that evening. "You're really going to do this?" "I am. Dutch will fight back. He's got lawyers, influence, money. I've got the truth." "Sometimes that has to be enough." Amos looked at her. "My whole life I've been running from the past. Turns out the past was chasing me the whole time, waiting for me to stand still long enough to catch up. Maybe this is why I ended up here. Maybe this is what Silas would have wanted. Someone to finish his work, tell his story, make sure he wasn't forgotten. You're a braver man than most." Amos McCrae, just a tired man who's done running. The days until the meeting passed slowly. Amos continued his deliveries, but everyone in town knew something bigger was coming. The tension built like thunderheads on the horizon, heavy with the promise of storms that could either clear the air or tear everything apart. And in the barn, surrounded by 40 years of undelivered mail and the truth about his family's destruction, Amos prepared to give his grandfather Silas the one thing he'd been denied in life: justice. However late it came, the tin wasn't something Amos had been looking for. He'd been reorganizing the last few crates, checking his inventory against the ledger one more time when the wooden bottom of one crate shifted under his weight. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a small photographer's tin. Inside were a dozen daguerreotypes, the old-style photographs on metal plates that had been popular in the 1880s. Most showed groups of townspeople, stiff and formal in their Sunday best. But one image stopped him cold. Two men stood side by side in front of what had to be this very barn, back when it was new. One was younger, maybe in his 30s, with McCrae written in faded ink on the back. Silas, almost certainly. The other man was older, prosperous-looking, with a bearing that suggested authority. Samuel Keller was written beneath his image. They weren't just standing together. Their arms were around each other's shoulders. They were smiling, as much as people smiled in those formal photographs. The image spoke of friendship, maybe even genuine affection. These were partners, not enemies. Amos found Martha at the cafe and showed her the photograph. She studied it carefully, then looked up with troubled eyes. "I've heard old stories. Samuel Keller and Silas McCrae started this mail station together back in '83. It was supposed to be a business partnership, but something went wrong." "What went wrong?" "No one really knows. My mother used to say they'd had a falling out over land, but the details were murky. What I do know is that by early 1885 they weren't speaking, and by March Silas was gone and Samuel owned everything." Amos added this to the growing picture in his mind. Friends turned bitter enemies. A land deal that promised wealth. A deed that never arrived. It wasn't just theft, it was betrayal of the deepest kind. He spent the next 2 days at the tiny library, such as it was, poring over old newspapers and records that the librarian, a sharp-minded woman named Agnes Morrison, helped him locate. The picture that emerged was damning. March 14th, 1885. Station Master Silas McCrae reports for duty. No unusual activity noted. March 15th, 1885. Station Master did not report for work. Station remains closed. Authorities investigating. March 16th, 1885. Marshal reports Station Master Silas McCrae missing. Postal funds also unaccounted for. Suspected theft and flight. March 20th, 1885. Mail station officially closed pending investigation. Samuel Keller assumes temporary custody of postal materials. April 1st, 1885. Investigation concludes Silas McCrae absconded with postal funds. Arrest warrant issued. Property and station assets seized by territorial authorities. Samuel Keller purchases station and land at auction. It was all there, laid out in official language that made theft look legal. But the timing was too convenient. The deed arrived on March 14th. Silas disappeared on the 15th. By April 1st, Samuel Keller owned everything. 3 weeks to destroy a man's life and steal his family's future. "There's more," Agnes said, bringing him another folder. "These are personal effects that were stored in the library's archive. When Silas disappeared, some of his things were held by the marshal's office, then eventually donated here when the case went cold. Inside the folder was a small leather journal. Amos's hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was the same as in the station ledger, Silas McCrae's careful script. But these entries were personal, not official records. He skipped to the final pages, his heart pounding. February 20th, 1885. Samuel came by again today, pressing me to convince William to sell the land once the deed arrives. I refused again. The land is my son's future, his security. I won't take it from him, no matter what Samuel offers. His anger frightens me, but I must stand firm. March 1st, 1885. Samuel's offers have become threats. He says I'll regret my stubbornness, that I'm making an enemy of a powerful man. But what kind of father would I be if I sold my son's inheritance for fear? March important mail in a hidden compartment in the desk. If something happens to me, perhaps someday someone will find it and deliver what I could not. The deed arrives this week. I must ensure William receives it. March 14th, 1885. The deed is here. I've confirmed it's legitimate. William will finally have what he deserves. But I fear for my family. Samuel Keller knows the deed has arrived. The whole town seems to know. I've locked everything in the station, and I'm sleeping here tonight to keep watch. If I'm right about Samuel's intentions, I won't give him the chance to steal what belongs to my son. The final entry was barely legible. Written in obvious haste, March 15th, 1885 dawn. Samuel and 2 men just rode up. They're armed. I've hidden this journal and the most important letters where only someone truly searching would find them. If I don't survive this, know that I tried to protect my family. Know that William is the rightful owner of that land. Know that Samuel Keller is a thief and The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Amos closed the journal carefully, his vision blurring. His grandfather had known he was about to die, had known his family would be destroyed, and he'd tried in those final moments to leave evidence that someone someday might use to expose the truth. 40 years. It had taken 40 years for someone to find that evidence. And that someone happened to be Silas's own grandson, a man who'd wandered his entire life without knowing why he had no home to return to. Amos took the journal and the photographs back to the barn. That evening, as the sun set and painted the prairie gold, he had 2 visitors. Dutch Keller arrived first, no longer bothering with pretense. I know what you found. Do you? My grandfather's letter to Silas, the photographs. Probably that damn journal too. Dutch stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. You think you're going to destroy my family with 40-year-old accusations? I'm going to tell the truth. What happens after that isn't up to me. The truth. Dutch laughed bitterly. The truth is that my grandfather built an empire in this territory, brought jobs, prosperity, stability. So maybe he did something wrong at the start. Does that erase everything else? Does that mean his children and grandchildren should lose everything? My grandfather did something right and lost everything. My father grew up poor and angry because of what your grandfather took. I've had no home, no roots, no family because of what happened here. Amos stepped closer. So yes, I think the truth matters, even 40 years later. Dutch's hand moved toward his belt, where Amos noted he was carrying a pistol. My lawyers will destroy you. I'll tie you up in court for years. You'll spend every penny you have and still lose, maybe. Or maybe people will finally see the Kellers for what you are, thieves, who murdered a good man to steal his family's future. Dutch's face went red. My grandfather didn't murder anyone. Silas McCrae ran off. Then why are you so afraid of the truth coming out? Dutch left without answering, and Amos knew he'd made an enemy for life. But he'd made an enemy the moment he found those letters. There was no avoiding this confrontation. It had been 40 years in the making. His second visitor was James Keller, who looked troubled and determined. My grandfather just left here. He did. He's talking about filing lawsuits, using his influence to run you out of town. I tried to reason with him, but he's beyond reason. James paused. I found some old letters in our family papers. Correspondence between Samuel Keller and a territorial marshal. Money changed hands to ensure the investigation concluded the way Samuel wanted. You'd testify to that. At your town meeting? Yes, and I'll bring the letters as evidence. James met his eyes. I know what this means for my family, but I've got to live with myself, and I can't do that knowing we built everything on murder and lies. After James left, Amos sat alone in the barn, surrounded by the artifacts of his grandfather's life and death. The station bell that Silas had rung to announce mail deliveries hung in the corner, tarnished but intact. On impulse, Amos took it down and polished it with his sleeve. The brass gleamed dully in the lamplight. Outside, Redemption Flats was transforming before his eyes. The mail deliveries had sparked something in the town, a renewed sense of connection and possibility. People were repairing buildings, painting storefronts, talking about the future instead of just surviving the present. Children who'd been listless and bored now followed Maud through the streets, eager to see where the next delivery would take them. Martha had organized a group of younger townspeople to help with deliveries. They'd formed a kind of informal mail corps, taking letters to distant ranches and homesteads that Amos couldn't reach alone. Each delivery sparked more stories, more connections, more healing of old wounds. Even Eli had been transformed by his brother's letter. He'd tracked down Samuel's descendants in California and written to them, reconnecting branches of the family tree that had been severed 40 years ago. It turned out Samuel had built a good life, had children and grandchildren who never knew their family back east existed. Now they did, and they were planning to visit. This was what the mail had done, not just delivered messages, but rebuilt connections that time and distance had broken. And Amos had been the instrument of that rebuilding, the unlikely postman who'd arrived with nothing but $9 and a stubborn heart. As the night deepened, Amos worked by lamplight, organizing the evidence he'd present at the town meeting. The photographs, the letters, Silas's journal. The deed that proved William McCrae's rightful ownership of the land Dutch Keller now claimed. Each piece told part of the story. Together, they told the truth. He was about to close up for the night when he noticed something odd about the desk where Silas had worked. Running his hand along the underside, he felt a seam, a hidden compartment, just like Silas had mentioned in his journal. The wood had swollen over the years, but with patience and a thin blade, Amos managed to work it open. Inside was a single sealed letter, addressed in Silas's hand to "Whoever finds this station." Amos's heart hammered as he opened it. The paper inside was covered in the same meticulous handwriting, but this was different from the journal entries. This was a testament, a final statement from a man who knew he was about to die. "To whoever finds this," it began. "If you're reading this, then I am dead, and my son William never received his rightful inheritance. Samuel Keller has done what I feared he would. But know this, the truth cannot stay buried forever. Someone someday will find this station and these letters. Someone will ask the questions that need asking. And when they do, I pray they have the courage to finish what I could not, deliver every piece of mail, tell every story, expose every lie. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not for the past, but for the future. If you're that person, know that I'm grateful. Know that you're doing work that matters. And know that sometimes the longest road home is the one that brings us exactly where we need to be." Silas McCrae, March 15, 1885. Amos read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His grandfather had written this for him, not knowing who he was or when he'd arrive, but knowing somehow that the right person would find this place, would understand the importance of the work, would have the courage to see it through. He folded the letter carefully and added it to his evidence. This would be the last thing he'd read at the meeting, after all the other truths had been told. This was Silas's voice, reaching across 40 years to speak to his grandson and to the town that had forgotten him. And Amos McCrae, who'd spent his life running from roots and connections, finally understood that he'd been running toward this moment all along. The confession was hidden at the very bottom of the last crate, sealed in an envelope marked with a single word, truth. Amos had almost missed it entirely. He'd been doing a final inventory before the town meeting, making sure he had every piece of evidence organized and ready. The crate had seemed empty, but when he'd lifted it to move it aside, something had shifted inside. The false bottom had been expertly crafted, designed to hide one final devastating secret. The envelope was thick, expensive paper that had aged to cream. Unlike the other mail, this one had no address, no postage, no official markings. Just that single word in shaky handwriting that Amos didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a letter written on fine stationery, dated July 3rd, 1920, 5 years ago. The handwriting wavered and struggled across the page, the work of someone whose body was failing, even as their conscience finally won its long battle. To whoever finds this station, my name is Samuel Keller, and I am dying. The doctors give me days, maybe hours. My son knows I'm writing this, has begged me not to, but I cannot go to my grave carrying this weight alone. Some confessions can't be made to the living, can only be left for strangers who might understand better than those who loved you. I murdered Silas McCrae. There it is, plain and simple after 40 years of lies. We were friends once, brothers in everything but blood. We built the mail station together, dreamed of making Redemption Flats into something great. But friendship died when I learned about the land grant coming to his son William. 800 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, and it was going to a man who had no idea what to do with it, who'd probably sell it for pennies or let it sit idle. I offered to buy it. Offered fair money, then generous money, then money that would have set the McCrae family up for life. But Silas refused. Said it was his son's birthright, his legacy. Said some things couldn't be bought at any price. I couldn't accept that. I had vision for what this territory could be, and that land was the key to everything. So when the deed arrived at the mail station on March 14th, 1885, I made my choice. I rode out before dawn on the 15th with 2 men I'd hired for muscle and discretion. We found Silas sleeping in the station. He'd been guarding the mail, protecting his son's future. I'll spare you the details of what happened. Enough to say that Silas fought, that he died hard, and that we buried him out on the prairie where no one would find him. We made it look like he'd stolen postal funds and run off. I had the marshal in my pocket, so the investigation went exactly as I needed it to. I took the deed, destroyed it, and used my connections to file my own claim to that land. With Silas gone and no deed to prove otherwise, William McCrae had nothing. The boy tried to fight it, but he was young and poor and had no proof of his father's claim. I crushed him easily. The mail station I locked up and left. Couldn't bear to destroy it, couldn't bear to let anyone see what it contained. So I bought it, locked it, and let it rot. I told myself it was finished, that I could live with what I'd done. I was wrong. 40 years of prosperity built on murder and theft. 40 years of watching William McCrae drink himself to death, knowing I'd destroyed him. 40 years of nightmares where Silas looks at me with dying eyes and asks why friendship meant so little. I'm writing this in the mail station, the place where I killed my best friend. I've brought it here and hidden it among the letters I prevented from being delivered. Someday someone will find this place. Maybe they'll deliver the mail like Silas wanted. Maybe they'll find this confession and finally give Silas the justice I denied him. I told my son everything before he died. He begged me to make it right, but I was too much a coward. Now my grandson Dutch knows too, and that knowledge has poisoned him. He's become hard and cruel, fighting to protect what I built, terrified someone will discover the truth. If you're reading this, you know the truth now. The Keller fortune, the Keller name, everything we have was stolen from Silas McCrae and his family. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want the truth known finally, after 40 years of lies. The deed I stole is still valid in law. Silas's heirs are the rightful owners of that land. What you do with that information is your choice. All I can do is confess and hope that truth, however late it comes, counts for something. Samuel Keller, July 3rd, 1920. Amos read the letter 3 times, each reading adding weight to what he already knew but couldn't quite believe. Samuel Keller had not only murdered his grandfather, but had felt guilty enough to confess, then hidden that confession where only someone who cared about the mail would ever find it. And Dutch Keller knew, had known for years, that his family's fortune was built on murder, had known that Amos McCrae, should one ever show up, was the rightful owner of the Keller ranch. The power Amos suddenly held was staggering. This wasn't just evidence of a 40-year-old crime. This was a confession from the criminal himself, legally documented, witnessed by the date and circumstance of its writing. Combined with the deed, Silas's journal, and the other evidence, this would not only expose the truth, but potentially give Amos legal claim to everything the Kellers owned. He could destroy them, could take everything they had, leaving Dutch and his family as dispossessed as the McCraes had been. Justice finally, after 40 years. The thought filled him with dark satisfaction for about 5 seconds before the hollowness of it set in. Revenge wouldn't bring back his grandfather, wouldn't give his father the childhood he deserved, wouldn't return the decades Amos himself had spent wandering, rootless and alone. Martha found him an hour later, still sitting with the confession letter in his hands. "Amos, the meeting's tomorrow. You need to rest." She saw his face and stopped. "What happened?" He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it, her expression shifting from shock to anger to something more complex. "This changes everything," she said finally. "With this and the deed, you could take the Keller ranch, all of it. It's legally yours. I know, you don't sound happy about it, because I'm not sure what the right thing to do is anymore." Amos stood, pacing the barn. "Yes, my family was wronged. Yes, the Kellers profited from murder. But Dutch's children, his grandchildren, they didn't commit any crime. They just inherited the consequences of one. Justice isn't about punishing the innocent. It's about exposing the truth. And what does exposing the truth accomplish? It tears apart a family, destabilizes this town, and gives me land I don't even want." He turned to face her. "I came here looking for peace, not a war. But you found a war anyway. You just didn't start it. Your grandfather did, when he refused to sell his principles. Eli arrived next, having heard about the discovery through the town's efficient gossip network. He read the confession in silence, then looked at Amos with something like pity. "This is a hard burden to carry," the old man said. "Knowing you have the power to right an old wrong, but that using that power might create new ones. What would you do?" Amos asked. "I'd ask myself what Silas would want. Not for revenge, but for his family and this town." Eli set down the letter carefully. "From what I've learned about your grandfather, he was a man who believed in doing right, even when it cost him. Maybe that's the McCrae legacy worth claiming. Not land or money, but integrity." After they left, Amos walked out to the old cemetery on the edge of town. He'd found Silas's grave earlier in the week, unmarked, forgotten, buried in the paupers section, with only a wooden cross that had long since rotted away. Someone, probably Silas's widow before she died, had planted wildflowers there. They still grew each spring, hardy and persistent. Amos stood at the grave as the sun set, thinking about the grandfather he'd never known, a man who'd valued his son's future over his own life, a man who'd fought to do right even knowing it would cost him everything, a man who'd left evidence behind, hoping someone would care enough to find it. "I found them," Amos said quietly to the earth. "Found all your letters, your journal, your truth. I can finish your work, deliver every piece of mail like you wanted. But this other thing, the revenge, the reclaiming of stolen land, I don't know if that's what you'd want. Don't know if that's who I want to be." The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of autumn grass and distant rain. No answer came, but Amos hadn't really expected one. The dead couldn't tell him what to do. He had to figure that out for himself. The next morning he made his decision. He would tell the truth at the meeting, all of it, including Samuel's confession and the valid deed that made him the legal owner of the Keller ranch. But he wouldn't decide in advance what to do with that power. He'd let the truth stand on its own and see where it led. Dutch Keller appeared at the barn around noon, looking haggard. "James told me you found another letter." My grandfather's confession. I did. And you're going to use it to destroy us. I'm going to tell the truth. What happens after that isn't just up to me. Dutch's shoulders sagged. My grandfather was a murderer. My father spent his whole life carrying that guilt. I've spent mine trying to protect a fortune I always knew was stolen. He looked around the barn. You know what the worst part is? I actually liked your grandfather. Found his journal years ago, read his entries. He was a good man, and we killed him for being honest. You didn't kill him. Samuel did. I've benefited from his murder my whole life. That makes me complicit. Dutch met his eyes. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm just asking that you remember my children. And grandchildren didn't choose this. They're innocent. So was my father. So was I. Innocence didn't protect us from the consequences of your grandfather's choices. After Dutch left, James came by one more time. He brought a leather folder containing more evidence. Correspondence between Samuel Keller and the territorial marshal showing clear bribery. Land office records that had been falsified. Witness statements that had been coerced or bought. I've been through our family papers, James said. Found everything Samuel tried to hide. It's all here. Proof of the conspiracy, the cover-up, everything. He handed the folder to Amos. I'm testifying tomorrow night. Against my own family, if necessary. Because this has to end. You'll lose everything too, you know. If I claim that land legally, the Keller Ranch falls apart, then it falls apart. James's jaw was set. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and built on murder. That's what my great-grandfather should have chosen. It's what I'm choosing now. That evening, Amos sat in the barn one last time before the meeting, surrounded by the physical evidence of two families destroyed by one man's greed. The carved horse for Sarah Thornton, the soldier's farewell letter, the McCrae family correspondence, Silas's journal, Samuel's confession, and the deed that changed everything. He thought about Maud, standing peacefully in her stall, about Martha's kindness and support, about Eli's wisdom and James's courage, about all the people in Redemption Flats who'd been touched by the mail deliveries, who'd found connections and healing through letters that should have arrived 40 years ago. This had never been just about him and the Kellers. It was about a whole town trying to move forward from a past they didn't fully understand. And tomorrow night, he'd give them that understanding, complete and unvarnished. What they and he did with it would determine whether Redemption Flats lived up to its name or remained trapped in the crimes of 1885. He polished Silas's bell one more time, making sure it would ring clear and true. Tomorrow he'd ring it 3 times, the old signal for important announcements. And then he'd tell a story 40 years in the making, about murder and theft, about justice delayed and truth revealed, about a friendship betrayed and a family destroyed. And somewhere in that story, maybe he'd find the answer to who Amos McCrae wanted to be, a man seeking revenge for generations of wrong, or a man choosing something harder and better. The church was the only building in Redemption Flats large enough to hold the entire town. Built in better times, it had high ceilings and wooden pews that could seat maybe 70 people if they squeezed together. By 6:30, every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, crowded in the doorway, peered through the windows from outside. Amos arrived early with Martha and Eli, carrying a wooden box containing all the evidence. He'd spent the morning organizing everything in chronological order, creating a narrative that would be clear and undeniable. The photographs, the letters, the journals, the deed, and finally Samuel Keller's confession. Each piece built on the last, telling a story that had been buried for 40 years. Martha had helped him prepare his words. He wasn't a natural speaker, had spent most of his life keeping quiet, watching rather than being watched. But this wasn't about performance. It was about truth, and truth didn't require eloquence, just honesty. You ready for this? She asked as they set up a table at the front of the church. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Eli had brought the station master's bell from the barn, polished until it gleamed. It sat on the table like a witness, ready to call everyone to attention, just as Silas had used it to announce important deliveries decades ago. The townspeople filed in with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Some knew what was coming. The story had spread in fragments, whispers about stolen land and old crimes. Others came out of simple curiosity, eager for something to break the monotony of their hard lives. Sarah Thornton arrived and made her way to the front, carrying the carved horse her father had made. "I want people to see this," she said to Amos. "Want them to understand what you've been doing. All along, giving people back what was stolen from them." Others, who'd received deliveries, came forward with their own letters and packages. The soldier's farewell, the love letters between the Coopers, the brother's letter to Eli. Each one represented a connection restored, a voice heard across time. They placed them on the table beside Amos's evidence, a testament to the power of mail delivered. However late, Dutch Keller arrived at 6:45 with 3 men in expensive suits, lawyers from the territorial capital, no doubt. They took seats in the back, Dutch's face set in grim determination. He knew what was coming, had known since Amos found the confession. But he'd come anyway. Perhaps because not coming would be an admission of guilt, or perhaps because some part of him needed to finally face the truth publicly. James Keller came separately, carrying his own folder of evidence. He sat in the middle of the church, deliberately not with his grandfather, making his allegiance clear to everyone watching. The whispers this caused rippled through the crowd, like wind through wheat. At 7 o'clock exactly, Amos stood and lifted the bell. The weight of it felt right in his hand, solid, purposeful, ready. He rang it 3 times, the clear brass tones cutting through the murmur of conversation and bringing instant silence. "Thank you all for coming," Amos began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Most of you know me as the man who bought the old Hutchins barn for $9. Some of you think I'm foolish. Some think I'm kind. Some think I'm stirring up trouble best left alone." He paused, making eye contact with Dutch Keller in the back, then with James in the middle, then with Martha beside him. "Tonight I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story, documented and proven, about what happened in this town 40 years ago. About friendship and betrayal, about theft and murder, about families destroyed and fortunes built on blood. And when I'm done, you'll understand why that barn sat locked for all those years, and why the mail inside was never delivered." The silence deepened. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Amos picked up the first photograph, the one showing Silas McCrae and Samuel Keller with their arms around each other. This was taken in 1883, when these 2 men were friends, partners. They built the mail station together, dreamed of making Redemption Flats prosper. Silas McCrae was my grandfather, though I never knew him. Samuel Keller was Dutch's grandfather, and he was, by all accounts, a charismatic and ambitious man. He passed the photograph to the front row, letting it circulate through the crowd. For 2 years, they worked together successfully. But in 1885, something changed. Silas's son, William, my father, was granted 800 acres of prime grazing land by the territorial government. The deed was to be delivered through the mail station. That land is now the heart of the Keller Ranch. The murmur started again, but Amos pressed on. Samuel Keller wanted that land. He made offers to buy it, increasingly generous offers. But Silas refused to convince his son to sell. That land was William's future, his security. In Silas's mind, some things couldn't be bought at any price. Amos pulled out the letters between Samuel and Silas, reading excerpts that showed the escalating tension between former friends. Then he opened Silas's journal and read the entries that documented the threats, the fear, the final preparations. On March 14, 1885, the deed arrived at the mail station. Silas locked himself inside to guard it, knowing his friend had become his enemy. He never left that building alive. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Dutch Keller's face had gone pale, but he didn't move, didn't object. Silas disappeared on March 15th. The marshal's investigation concluded he'd stolen postal funds and fled. But Silas didn't steal anything, and he didn't flee. He was murdered for refusing to betray his son. Amos held up the deed, still legally valid, still bearing William McCrae's name. This is what he died protecting, and this he held up Samuel's confession, is the truth, written by the man who killed him. The room erupted in shock and anger. People turned to stare at Dutch Keller, whose lawyers were frantically whispering to him. But Dutch himself sat frozen, staring at Amos with something that looked like relief mixed with dread. "I'm going to read this confession to you now," Amos said, raising his voice over the noise. "Not to shame the Keller family, but because truth matters. Because my grandfather died trying to do the right thing. And the least I can do is make sure people know it." He began to read Samuel Keller's confession, word by word, letting the dead man's voice fill the church. The brutal honesty of it, the guilt, the justifications that fell flat in the face of murder, all of it laid bare before the town that had prospered from that crime without knowing it. As he read, Amos found himself thinking about his father. William McCrae had died at 42, worn out by drink and despair. Amos had been 17 then, already planning his escape from the poverty and bitterness that defined the McCrae name. He'd thought his father weak, had resented him for not being stronger, for not providing better. But now he understood. William had grown up knowing his father had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, had spent his whole life poor and dispossessed, had watched the Kellers prosper on land that should have been his. That kind of injustice could break anyone, and Amos himself, his whole life of wandering, of never putting down roots, of keeping people at arm's length, all of it traced back to this moment in 1885. He'd been shaped by a crime committed 20 years before he was born, carried its weight without understanding why he felt so rootless, so disconnected from the world. The confession ended with Samuel's plea for forgiveness and his hope that someday someone would care enough to expose the truth. Amos set down the letter and looked at the faces staring back at him. "The law says this deed is still valid," he said quietly. "That makes me, as Silas McCrae's only living heir, the rightful owner of the Keller Ranch. 800 acres of the most valuable land in this territory. I could claim it tomorrow, and no court would deny me." Dutch Keller stood, his face ashen. "And you'd be within your rights to do so." "Sit down, Dutch," one of his lawyers hissed, but Dutch ignored him. "My grandfather murdered Silas McCrae and stole his land. My father knew about it and did nothing. I've known for 20 years and protected that secret because I was too much a coward to face what it meant." Dutch's voice carried across the silent church. "If Amos McCrae wants to take everything we have, he's earned that right. The Kellers built our fortune on blood and lies. Maybe it's time we paid for that." The admission stunned the room into silence. Even his lawyers looked shocked. James Keller stood next. "I've brought additional evidence that corroborates everything Mr. McCrae has said. Letters showing my great-grandfather bribed the marshal, land office records that were falsified, witness statements that were bought or coerced." He set his folder on the table beside Amos's evidence. "I stand with Mr. McCrae in demanding truth and justice, whatever that means for my family." The church erupted in arguing voices, some supporting the Kellers despite everything, some calling for justice, some simply trying to process 40 years of lies suddenly exposed. Amos let them argue for a few minutes, then rang the bell again. "There's one more letter," he said when silence returned. "The last thing Silas wrote before he died." He read his grandfather's final message, the one hidden in the desk, addressed to whoever would find the station. The words about truth and justice, about finishing work left undone, about the longest roads leading us home. When he finished, many people in the church were crying openly. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do with that deed," Amos said. "Don't know if claiming the land serves justice or just continues the cycle of harm. But I know this. My grandfather died believing in something bigger than revenge. He died protecting his son's future, yes, but also protecting the integrity of the mail service, the connections between people, the truth itself." He gestured to the letters on the table, the ones from his deliveries. "For the past month, I've been delivering mail that should have been delivered 40 years ago. Every letter has connected people, healed old wounds, brought light to darkness. That's the legacy Silas McCrae wanted. Not revenge, but connection. Not punishment, but truth." Amos looked directly at Dutch Keller. "You say your family should pay for what your grandfather did." Maybe you're right, but payment can take many forms. The question is, what would actually heal this town? What would honor Silas's memory better, tearing down the Kellers or building something new together? Martha stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Amos McCrae has done more for this town in a month than we've done for ourselves in decades. He's brought us together, reminded us of our shared history, shown us that connection matters. Whatever he decides about that deed, I trust his judgment. Eli rose next. I've known about the rumors concerning Silas McCrae my whole life. Always wondered if there was truth to them. Now we know there was, but we also know Silas's grandson came back to finish his work, even not knowing he was doing it. That means something. One by one, people who'd received their letters stood and spoke. Sarah Thornton, holding her father's carved horse. The Coopers, with their love letters. The Blackwell, who'd learned his uncle's final thoughts. Each one testified to what the deliveries had meant, how they'd healed old wounds and brought closure. Finally, Amos held up the deed one more time. This piece of paper represents everything my family lost and everything the Kellers gained through murder. It gives me power I never asked for and choices I never wanted to make. I'm going to think hard about what to do with it. But whatever I decide, it won't be made in anger or revenge. It'll be made thinking about what Silas would want, what this town needs, and what kind of man I want to be. He rang the bell 3 times again, signaling the end of the meeting. But no one moved. They all sat, stunned and processing, trying to reconcile 40 years of lies with the truth now laid bare before them. Dutch Keller approached the front slowly, his lawyers trailing behind objecting. He stood before Amos, and for a long moment the two men just looked at each other, one the grandson of a murderer, one the grandson of his victim. "I'm sorry," Dutch said finally, "for all of it. For what my grandfather did, for what I didn't do. You'd be justified in taking everything." "Maybe," Amos said. "Or maybe there's a better way forward." He didn't know what that way was yet. But standing in that church, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by letters delivered 40 years late, with his grandfather's bell in his hand and his grandfather's truth finally spoken, Amos McCrae felt something he hadn't felt in his entire life. He felt home. The silence that followed Dutch's apology was broken by one of his lawyers, a sharp-faced man who stepped forward with the practiced confidence of someone used to winning arguments through intimidation. "This is all very emotional," the lawyer said, addressing the crowd rather than Amos. "But let's be clear about what we're actually discussing. A 40-year-old letter that conveniently appears just as Mr. McCrae needs evidence to support his claim. How do we know this confession is genuine? How do we know it wasn't fabricated?" The accusation hung in the air, and Amos saw some faces in the crowd shift from sympathy to doubt. It was a reasonable question and one that needed answering. "I can prove it's genuine," James Keller said, standing again. He pulled out several documents from his folder. "These are letters written by Samuel Keller throughout his life. Business correspondence, personal notes, even his will. The handwriting is identical to the confession. I've had experts verify it." "Experts you hired," the lawyer countered. "Hardly unbiased." "Then bring in your own experts," James shot back. "Test the paper, the ink, everything. I'm confident what you'll find is that my great-grandfather wrote that confession exactly when he said he did, 5 years ago." On his deathbed, Dutch Keller turned to his lawyer with something like disgust. "Stop it, Harrison. Just stop. Mr. Keller, I strongly advise—" "I don't care what you advise," Dutch's voice was raw. "My grandfather wrote that confession because he couldn't live with what he'd done. My father told me about it when I was 23 years old, made me swear never to tell anyone, said the guilt had eaten him alive his whole life, that he'd watched Silas McCrae's family suffer and known it was his father's fault." The lawyer tried to interrupt, but Dutch kept talking, years of suppressed truth pouring out. "My father died young, 52 years old, heart attack, but really it was guilt that killed him. Before he died, he made me promise to protect the family, to never let the truth out. And I kept that promise. I've spent 20 years living with that knowledge. watching the McCrae name disappear from this territory, knowing we thrived because we murdered a good man. His voice broke. Do you know what that does to a person? Waking up every day in a house built on blood? Raising children on land that was stolen? I wanted to make it right somehow, but I was too much a coward to face losing everything. So I just kept quiet, kept the secret, and hated myself a little more each year. The confession was devastating in its honesty. People who'd known Dutch their whole lives stared at him as if seeing a stranger. The weight of generational guilt visible in every line of his face, in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his hands shook as he spoke. The confession is real, Dutch said to the crowd. Every word of it. My grandfather murdered Silas McCrae on March 15, 1885. He buried him somewhere on the prairie and took his land. That's the truth, and I can't carry it alone anymore. One of the other lawyers tried to salvage the situation. Even if we accept the confession as genuine, the statute of limitations. There's no statute of limitations on murder, James interrupted. And there's certainly no statute on land theft. The deed Mr. McCrae holds is legally valid. The land transfer to Samuel Keller was based on fraud and falsified documents. My great-grandfather had no legal claim to that property. The McCrae family always had rightful ownership. Amos held up the deed, letting everyone see the official seals, the signatures, the legal language that granted William McCrae 800 acres of prime land. According to territorial law, this deed supersedes any subsequent claims. It was never voided, never cancelled, just prevented from being delivered. As William McCrae's son and only living heir, I'm the legal owner of Section 12, Township 4. The weight of those words settled over the church like snow. Amos watched the realization dawn on face after face. The Keller Ranch, the biggest employer in the region, the source of prosperity for many families. The foundation of Redemption Flat's economy was built on land that legally belonged to the man standing before them. Martha moved closer to him, her hand finding his. The gesture was small but significant. She was standing with him, whatever he decided. Eli, too, had moved to his side, showing his support. Others who'd received their long-lost letters shifted forward, creating a visible line between those who supported truth and those who feared its consequences. Through the church window, Amos caught sight of Maud tied to the post outside. The old donkey stood patient and calm, as she always did, waiting for him to finish his human business so they could go home. The sight of her steadied him, reminded him of who he was beneath all this drama and pain. He'd come to Redemption Flats with nothing but $9, a stubborn donkey, and a desire to finally stop running. He'd found a barn, then a mystery, then his own history, and now he stood at a crossroads, with the power to reshape not just his life, but the entire town's future. Dutch Keller's lawyers were whispering urgently to him, no doubt advising him to say nothing more, to fight this in court, to use every legal maneuver available. But Dutch ignored them, his eyes fixed on Amos. What are you going to do? Dutch asked. Are you going to take the land? The question hung there, and every person in the church leaned forward slightly, waiting for the answer. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Justice or mercy? Revenge or reconciliation? The choice that would define not just Amos's future, but the character of Redemption Flats itself. Amos looked down at the deed in his hands. 800 acres, a fortune, everything his family should have had, everything he'd never known, he'd lost until a month ago. He thought about his grandfather Silas, murdered for trying to protect this piece of paper, about his father William, dying bitter and broken, about himself, wandering for 40 years without roots because those roots had been cut before he was born. Then he looked at the faces around him. Sarah Thornton, holding her father's carved horse and smiling through tears. The Coopers, reunited with their young love through old letters. Eli connected again with his lost brother. All the people whose lives had been touched by simple acts of delivery, by mail that finally reached its destination. Decades late, his grandfather hadn't died for revenge. He died protecting his son's future, yes, but he'd also died believing in something larger, in duty, in service, in the connections that mail represented, in finishing what you started, no matter the cost. Amos set down the deed carefully and picked up Silas's bell one more time. He rang it once, calling everyone to attention for what he knew would be the most important words he'd ever speak. "I need time," he said quietly. "Time to think about what justice really means in this situation. Time to figure out what my grandfather would want, what this town needs, and what kind of man I choose to be." He looked directly at Dutch. "You've lived with guilt for 20 years. I've lived with the consequences of your family's crime my whole life, without even knowing it. Both of us are victims of what Samuel Keller did, in different ways." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not going to make this decision tonight, driven by anger or pain or the weight of the moment. I'm going to sleep on it, pray on it if I knew how, and think about it carefully. And then, tomorrow, I'll tell you all what I've decided." Martha's hand tightened on his, supportive and proud. Eli nodded approval. Even some of Dutch's defenders seemed relieved that Amos wasn't rushing to judgment. "But I will say this," Amos continued. "Whatever I decide, it won't be about punishing children for their grandfather's sins. It won't be about revenge. And it won't be about money or property. It'll be about what helps this town heal and move forward. Because that's what all of this has really been about. Healing old wounds, one letter at a time." He set down the bell with finality and began gathering up his evidence. The meeting was over, but the real decision was just beginning. Amos didn't sleep that night. He sat in the barn with Maud, the deed spread on the table before him, thinking about everything that had brought him to this moment. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to hold the ghosts of all the McCraes who'd come before him. Just before dawn, Martha found him there. She brought coffee and sat beside him without speaking, letting the silence settle between them like a shared blanket. "I know what I have to do," Amos said finally. "I've known since last night, but I needed to be sure. Tell me, taking the land won't bring my grandfather back, won't give my father the life he should have had, won't change the 40 years I spent wandering." He looked at her. "But it could destroy what's left of this town. The Keller Ranch employs half the people here. If it falls apart, Redemption Flats dies with it. So you're going to let them keep it? After everything? No, I'm going to do what Silas would have done. Find a way to serve the community, not just myself." He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. "I'm going to propose we split the land. Half stays with the Kellers. Half comes to me, representing my family's rightful share. But neither family keeps it for themselves. We put it all in a community trust." Martha read over his shoulder as he wrote. "A trust for what purpose? For Redemption Flats' future. Land for affordable housing, for new businesses, for young families to build on. Both families managing it together, neither one profiting more than the other. The land serves the town instead of just enriching individuals. That's incredibly generous. That's justice without revenge. That's healing instead of more hurt." Amos set down his pen. "My grandfather died protecting land that was meant to give his family security. But what kind of security is built on destroying someone else? I'd rather have less and sleep peacefully than have everything and carry the weight Dutch has been carrying." By the time the sun rose, Amos had his proposal written out clearly, with terms and conditions that seemed fair. He cleaned up, changed into his best shirt, and rode into town with Martha and Eli beside him. Word had spread that Amos would announce his decision at noon. The church filled again, even more crowded than the night before. Dutch Keller arrived looking like he hadn't slept either, his face haggard, but somehow more at peace than Amos had seen him. James came with him, sitting close this time, a show of family unity in the face of judgment. At noon exactly, Amos rang the bell 3 times and stood before the assembled crowd. "I've made my decision about the land," he said without preamble. "I'm not going to take it from the Kellers. But I'm not going to let things stay as they are either." He held up his handwritten proposal. "The deed says this land belongs to the McCrae family. The law supports that claim. But taking it all would just reverse the injustice, not solve it. So here's what I'm proposing. We split the 800 acres in half. 400 to the McCraes, 400 remaining with the Kellers. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Amos continued. Neither family keeps their portion for private use. Instead, we create the Redemption Flats Community Trust. The land gets used for the town's benefit, housing for young families, space for new businesses, common areas for everyone to enjoy. Dutch and James Keller manage half. I manage the other half. We make decisions together with the town's input, ensuring this land serves everyone instead of enriching a few. The shock was visible on every face. People had expected either total victory for Amos or a complete capitulation. No one had anticipated this: justice tempered with mercy, accountability mixed with grace. James Keller stood immediately. I accept those terms on behalf of my family. It's more than fair, more than we deserve. He walked to the front and extended his hand to Amos. The Kellers and McCraes working together, the way our grandfathers should have done from the start. Amos shook his hand, and the room erupted in spontaneous applause. People understood what they were witnessing. Not just a land deal, but a breaking of generational curses, a choosing of community over individual gain. Dutch Keller rose slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face. He approached the front with the heavy gait of someone carrying burdens finally being lifted. When he reached Amos, he didn't offer his hand immediately. Instead, he spoke to the entire church. Amos McCrae has shown me what my grandfather should have been, a man who puts principle over profit, community over personal gain. He's giving my family a second chance we don't deserve, and in doing so, he's giving this town a future. Dutch's voice broke. I'm sorry. To Amos, to the memory of Silas McCrae, to this town for living a lie all these years. The Keller family will honor this trust with everything we have. We'll work to make this right. Then he turned to Amos and extended his hand. Can you forgive us? Amos looked at the older man's hand for a long moment. This was Dutch Keller, whose family had stolen everything from his. This was the man who'd known the truth and stayed silent for 20 years. This was the enemy his family history demanded he hate. But Amos didn't feel hatred. He felt tired of carrying other people's grudges, tired of being defined by crimes committed before he was born. He thought of Silas, writing in his journal about hope and duty. He thought of his father, destroyed by bitterness. He thought of himself, finally understanding that forgiveness was the only way to break free. I can forgive, Amos said, taking Dutch's hand. Because holding on to anger won't heal anything. And because I think both our families have suffered enough. The handshake was firm, witnessed by the entire town. Cameras flashed. Someone had brought the photographer from the territorial newspaper, capturing the moment for history. One of the lawyers stepped forward. If you're serious about this trust, we should draft proper legal documents. I can have papers ready by week's end. Make them fair, Dutch said. Make them binding. Make sure neither family can undo this decision in the future, and make sure the town has a voice, Amos added. This is for them, not for us. The church filled with excited conversation as people began to understand what this meant. Families who'd struggled to afford land could now build. Young people who'd left for opportunities elsewhere might return. Businesses that had failed for lack of affordable space could try again. Sarah Thornton made her way to the front, still carrying her father's carved horse. This is what these letters were really about, wasn't it? Not just delivering messages, but delivering hope. Showing us that connection and community matter more than old grievances. That's what my grandfather believed, Amos said. I'm just finishing what he started. Eli embraced him roughly. Silas would be proud, son. You've honored his memory better than any revenge could have. Martha kissed his cheek, not caring who saw. You're a better man than most, Amos McCrae. James and Dutch stood together now, father and son, or grandfather and grandson, reconciled by someone else's mercy. Dutch put his arm around James's shoulders. You were right to stand for truth. Took more courage than I ever had. We'll do better going forward, James said. Both of us. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Amos one by one. Some thanked him. Others just touched his shoulder or shook his hand, unable to find words. The children who'd been following Maud around town gathered near the door, and one small girl tugged on his sleeve. "Are you staying here forever now?" she asked. Amos looked around at the faces. Martha and Eli, Sarah and the Coopers, Dutch and James, all the people whose lives had intersected with his through those undelivered letters. He thought about the barn that was now truly his home, about Maud waiting patiently outside, about work still to be done delivering the remaining mail. "Yes," he said to the child, "I think I am." And for the first time in his life, the word home didn't feel like a trap or a burden. It felt like a gift he'd finally learned to accept. 6 months changed everything. Redemption Flats no longer looked like a town waiting to die. New paint brightened the storefronts on Main Street, which the town council had officially renamed Silas McCrae Way. The old bank building, empty for years, now housed a general store that actually had customers. Young families were moving back, building modest homes on trust land that they could afford for the first time. The barn had become something unexpected, a community center and museum. The mail station itself was preserved exactly as Amos had found it, frozen in time behind glass, a testament to Silas McCrae's dedication and to the 40 years of stories trapped in darkness. Tourists came from the territorial capital and beyond to see the place, to hear the story, to understand how one man with $9 had changed an entire town. Amos lived in a small house he'd built on his portion of the trust land, simple but solid, with a proper stable for Maud. The old donkey had earned her comfort, and she spent her days in contented semi-retirement, though she still insisted on accompanying Amos on the final mail deliveries. Martha's cafe had become the heart of town in ways it never had been before. She'd expanded, added tables, hired help, but more importantly, it had become the place where people gathered to share stories, to reconnect, to build the kind of community that had been dying before Amos arrived. Their relationship had deepened into something neither of them had quite expected at their age. Gentle, companionable, occasionally romantic, always comfortable. They took their time, neither rushing toward anything, both having learned patience through hard years. James Keller managed the community trust alongside Amos, and they'd become genuine friends. They met twice a week to review requests for land use, to plan development, to ensure the trust served its purpose. James had finished law school and opened a small practice in town, offering affordable legal services that the area desperately needed. Dutch Keller had retired from active management of the ranch, turning operations over to James while he spent his days in quieter pursuits. He'd made peace with his past as much as anyone could, finding redemption not in denial but in honest accounting. He and Amos weren't close friends, but they developed mutual respect. Two men who'd both been shaped by Samuel Keller's crime and had chosen to break that cycle. The mail deliveries had finally been completed. 347 pieces total, each one a story, each one a connection restored. Some deliveries brought tears, others laughter. A few brought both. An elderly woman discovered her sister hadn't abandoned the family after all, but had written faithfully for years from California. A man learned his father had tried to send money during hard times, proving love that circumstance had hidden. A widow received a love poem from her late husband, written when they were young, and everything seemed possible. Each delivery reinforced what Amos had learned. That connection mattered. That being remembered mattered, that the things we send out into the world carry weight even when they don't reach their destination right away. He'd kept a journal of every delivery, recording not just who received what, but how they responded, what it meant to them, how it changed their understanding of their own history. Sarah Thornton had donated her father's carved horse to the museum, where it sat in a place of honor alongside other artifacts from the letters. But she'd commissioned a replica from a local woodworker, and it sat on her mantel at home, a reminder that her father had loved her even across the distance of duty and death. On a warm spring evening, as Amos was closing up the museum for the day, he noticed something odd about the sorting bins. One of the slots had a crack in the back that he'd never seen before. Curious, he worked his fingers behind the wood and felt paper. The letter that emerged was addressed simply, "To my future grandson." Amos's hands shook as he carried it outside into the fading sunlight. He sat on the bench, where tourists usually gathered, the letter weighing almost nothing but feeling immeasurably heavy. This was meant for him. Silas had somehow known, had left one final message for a grandson he'd never meet. The paper was brittle with age, but the words were clear. "To my future grandson, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way home. I don't know who you are, what your name is, whether you look like me or your grandmother. But I know you're a McCrae, and I know the road that brought you here was likely hard. I'm writing this on March 14th, 1885, the day the deed arrived that should secure our family's future. But I fear that future won't unfold as I've planned. I've made an enemy of a powerful man by choosing principle over profit, and I suspect I'll pay a price for that choice. If I'm right, and you found this place after years of our family suffering, I want you to know some things. First, that I loved you before you existed. Loved the idea of you, the hope of you, the future generations of McCraes who would carry our name forward. Second, that any hardship you've endured because of what happens to me is not your burden to carry. You don't owe me revenge. You don't owe me justice. You're free to make your own choices, but if you choose to finish what I started, do it with love, not anger. Do it to heal, not to hurt. Do it to build bridges, not to burn them down. The McCrae family was never about wealth or land or power. We're about duty, service, and doing right, even when it costs us. That's the legacy worth claiming. I hope you find peace here. I hope you find family, not just through blood, but through choice. I hope the loneliest roads have led you exactly where you need to be. And I hope someday you understand that coming home isn't about returning to a place, but about finally stopping long enough to let the place find you, with love across time. Your grandfather, Silas McCrae, Amos read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. His grandfather had known, had understood even facing his own death, that healing mattered more than revenge, that future generations didn't owe debts to the past, that the McCrae legacy was about character, not compensation. He folded the letter carefully and looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Redemption Flats spread below him, transformed from dying town to living community. Lights were coming on in new houses. Children played in the streets. Martha's cafe glowed warm and welcoming. Maud wandered over and nudged his shoulder, her way of saying it was time to go home. Amos scratched behind her ears and stood, the letter tucked safely in his pocket. "Come on, girl. Let's go home." As they walked down the hill, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 40 years of wandering, of never belonging, of searching for something he couldn't name. And then $9, a forgotten barn, and letters that had waited in darkness for someone who cared enough to bring them into light. He delivered 347 pieces of mail and found himself in the process. Had uncovered his family's history, confronted injustice, and chosen mercy over revenge. Had built friendships from ashes, turned enemies into partners, and transformed a dying town into a place of hope. Behind them, someone rang the station bell. It now served as the town's evening bell, calling people home to dinner, marking the end of the workday, reminding everyone that connection and community weren't luxuries but necessities. The sound carried across the valley, clear and true. Silas's bell still serving its purpose 40 years after his death. Amos paused to listen, and as the last echo faded, he understood something fundamental. His grandfather had guided him here through those letters, through that hidden station, through the choice to do right instead of taking revenge. Every step of the journey had been leading him home, not to a place on a map, but to an understanding of who he was meant to be. He wasn't just Amos McCrae, the wanderer. He was Amos McCrae, grandson of Silas, keeper of connections, finisher of unfinished work. He was home, finally and completely, in a place he'd never known existed but had been searching for his entire life. Sometimes the loneliest roads do lead us exactly where we need to be. Sometimes $9 buys more than a barn. It buys redemption, not just for the buyer, but for everyone who'd been waiting in darkness for someone to care enough to bring light. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, the longest journey ends not with arrival, but with the simple, profound realization that we've been home all along. We just needed to stop running long enough to recognize it. Amos and Maud walked down the hill toward the lights of Redemption Flats, toward Martha's cafe and Eli's store and James's office, and all the people whose lives had been touched by letters delivered 40 years late. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, constant and eternal, marking the path home for all the wanderers still searching. The station bell rang one final time in the distance, calling everyone home. And Amos McCrae, who'd spent his life answering to no one and belonging nowhere, finally answered that call.